Here then we see self-consciousness withdrawn into its innermost being, for which all externality as such has vanished, withdrawn into the contemplation of the I equals I, in which this I is the whole of essentiality and existence. It is submerged in this notion of itself, for it has been driven to the limit of its extremes, and moreover in such a way that the moments distinguished whereby it is real or is still consciousness are not only for us these pure extremes. On the contrary, what it is for itself and what is for it intrinsic and what is for it existence have evaporated into abstractions, which no longer have any stability, any substance for this consciousness itself. And all that before was essential being for consciousness has reverted into these abstractions. Refined into purity, consciousness exists in its poorest form, and the poverty which constitutes its sole possession is itself a vanishing. This absolute certainty into which substance has resolved itself is the absolute untruth, which collapses internally. It is the absolute self-consciousness in which consciousness is submerged. If we wanted to be facetious, we could say that paragraph 657 is the absolute turning point of this morality section. And why do I say that that would be facetious? Because Hegel uses the term absolute so many times in here. And his philosophy is a philosophy of the absolute, but we don't see the absolute emerging as such quite so often in the course of the dialectical developments in the phenomenology. This paragraph is chock full of it. And you might say, well, what's that about? Well, he is telling us that we're reaching a kind of limit point that the dialectic, you might say, phenomenological investigation of what is actually going on in morality and particularly in conscience, how is that playing itself out? Something raises itself almost like stones coming out of the soil, the bedrock that we can see. A great example of this is, if you've ever been to New Hampshire, it's called the Granite State in part because there's so many formations where the granite is coming out of the dirt and you can see the rocks underneath. Not so great for farming in many respects, but quite dramatic. And here we're getting to see, you might say, the underbelly or how things really are, how they stand. Now, this is not meant to be a one-time, solved-it-for-all sort of pessimistic solution to things, so we shouldn't take it that way. But there is a lot of stuff going on here, and I want to begin at the end of this and then sort of trace our way back to the beginning and come through it. So he talks in the very last sentence about a bunch of absolutes. He says, this absolute certainty into which substance has resolved itself is the absolute untruth which collapses internally. It is the absolute self-consciousness in which consciousness is submerged. So you notice three absolutes right there in one single sentence, and there's a lot of equating these absolutes, or saying that one of these is the other, and each of these is providing us with a different way of looking at things. Now, that should bring into some question the use of this term absolute. None of these absolutes are actually absolute, because they're all related to each other in this way. And let's hesitate for a moment on these different absolutes. We have absolute certainty, Gewissheit, right? And this entire section is about conscience, Gewissen, so there's a strong connection there. This absolute certainty is absolute untruth, Unwahrheit. And notice he doesn't say an absolute lie. He doesn't even say absolute falsity, right? Falschheit. He doesn't say anything like that. Instead, this is just a negative of truth, the lack of truth. And there's a lot of ways in which truth can be missing. As I just mentioned, a lie, truth is missing in a very set of determinate ways. We're going to look at, later on in this section at hypocrisy. And you could say that's also a form of untruth that reveals certain truths that don't map onto other things that we know to be true, right? this is more of a, there isn't truth there. And that should, raise our antenna a little bit, you could say. So we'll come back to that by the end of this, and probably even more so in the next paragraph. He also talks about absolute self-consciousness. That's an interesting way to talk, isn't it? Because can self-consciousness really be absolute, given that self-consciousness, as we discovered in the self-consciousness section, and in all the refinements in the reason and spirit section up to this point, self-consciousness is always self-consciousness in relation to an other, and not just an other that is an other of consciousness, but an other self-consciousness, right? The other of self-consciousness is an other self-consciousness. So it can never truly be just what it is. It can't be a substance. It can't be something that is purely in itself. It always has to be for itself and for others. So what does it mean to be absolute self-consciousness? This is where we get to see that absolute self-consciousness is really illusory. You can't have it at this point. And he talks about consciousness, and consciousness by itself is always consciousness of something, right? This is phenomenological. So the consciousness of what in this case? He doesn't answer that question. He's speaking very abstractly. He tells us that consciousness is submerged in this. He uses this language of vanishing, being submerged, sinking into a lot in this section. Things are going into other things and thereby being, you could say, lost in the process. Can consciousness be entirely absorbed in self-consciousness? If we do that, we kind of lose the world, don't we? We lose others as well. And so this is a fitting place to return to what is being left behind at this point. And this is what he's talking about at the start of this. He tells us, here then we see self-consciousness withdrawn into its innermost being. So part of what makes self-consciousness is the capacity to be reflexive, to take a stand upon itself, right? And we can also say that self-consciousness is what can say I of itself. And that is what it's doing here. The I equals I. Ich ist ich, right? These are an identity statement, but it's always vacuous. So self-consciousness returns into its innermost self, which is supposed to be, full of richness and substance. And, we finally attain the whole point of morality and all the other stuff leading up to this. And then he says, for this, all externality as such has vanished, withdrawn into the contemplation of the I equals I. So does this mean that the external world has actually gone away, or the social world of others, their expectations, and all the dynamics? No, but he uses this word abstraction a little bit later on. An abstraction is going on the part of self-consciousness. It is making of itself, through its own agency and activities, a thing separated off from other things. So externality doesn't go away, but externality as such, Äußerlichkeit als solche, goes away for this brief moment of this paragraph. What else has been left behind? Well, what was talked about in the previous paragraphs, right? If you look at paragraph 655 and 656, we get this, incredibly optimistic point of view, don't we? I'll just read a little bit the start of 656. This solitary divine worship is at the same time essentially the divine worship of a community. The pure inner knowing and perceiving of itself advances to the moment of consciousness. The contemplation of itself is its objective existence, and this objective element is the declaration of its knowing and willing as something universal. Isn't that great? And later on, he's talking about this. This is a community, Gemeinde, of self-consciousnesses, and it looks like we have finally gotten to the point where self-consciousness has attained to what it's been looking for this entire time. recognition, anerkennen, what it was seeking out in the early parts of self-consciousness, in the master-slave dialectic, in those three forms of consciousness that surpass that stoicism, skepticism, the unhappy consciousness, which you notice Hegel's going to talk about in the next paragraph. All of that is being left behind, sort of like the proverbial ladder that's discarded once you have actually climbed up. Now, this makes it illusory. And by it, I mean all of this. The I that is equal to the I. He goes on and he sketches out how this I, this self-consciousness withdrawn into itself, figures itself. He says, in which this I is the whole, the totality of essentiality, Wesentlichkeit, and existence, Dasein. Right? So everything that is, or everything that matters, everything that is determinative is there in the I. Then he tells us, again, he uses this language of sinking into, falling into. So he says, it is submerged in this notion of itself. Now, notion is Begriff, right? It vanishes, or it sinks into this notion of itself, which seems to be a good thing. So self-consciousness becomes now a concept or notion of the self, but what does it actually have? Hegel goes on and he tells us, it has been driven to the limit of its extremes, and moreover in such a way that the moments distinguished whereby it is real or is still consciousness, attached to things, the community, the outside world, its duties, he says, are not only for us these pure extremes, on the contrary, what it is for itself, and what is for it intrinsic, and what is for it existence, here's the key point, have evaporated into abstractions. Abstractions. Now, what is it to be abstract? You say, well, it means to be an idea in somebody's head. Yeah, but some ideas are abstract and some ideas aren't. My idea of the children that I will talk to later tonight is not really an abstract idea. My idea of children per se could be an abstraction, right? So ideas can be more or less abstract as well, we should keep in mind. It's not as if there's like ideas that are abstract and then whatever we're going to oppose to the abstract, the concrete, the particular, the specific, the real. No, it's more of a gradation. And some ideas can be so abstract as to become almost like mere sounds that sound cool, that we have some sort of emotional attachment to, and don't have any real content. Then they're not concepts in that case. So what does Hegel say here? These are pure abstractions, and he tells us these no longer have any stability, no halt, right? No substance, he uses the word substance there, for this consciousness itself. If they don't have any for this consciousness itself, they don't have it for anybody, because these are this consciousness's ideas that it's working with. And then he goes on and he says, all that was before essential being for consciousness has reverted into these abstractions. That's really important. Everything that was essential being is now abstractions, and this is a form of poverty. He talks about this, refined into this purity, consciousness exists in its poorest form. The poverty which constitutes its sole possession is itself a vanishing. What are these sorts of things? Well, anything that would tell us about the self and about the thing that we've been wanting to know about this entire, its duties and actions, and whether it's good or bad or any of that. It's all become abstractions at this point. So, why use this word untruth? That's a good way of describing abstractions. They're not actually false. They don't refer to anything in this case, right? So, and they kind of cohere with each other, but in a way that doesn't mean a damn thing. So where are we going to go from here? Well, this is, as I mentioned, a turning point. Looking at this submergence of consciousness within itself, we see that the unexplicated substance is, for consciousness, knowledge as its knowledge. As consciousness, it is divided into the antithesis of itself and its object, which is for it essence. But it is just this object that is perfectly transparent, is its own self, and its consciousness is only this knowledge of itself. All life, all spiritual essentiality, has withdrawn into this self and has lost its difference from the I itself. The moments of consciousness are, therefore, these extreme abstractions, none of which endures, but each of which loses itself in the other and produces it. It is the fluctuating attitude to itself of the unhappy consciousness. But here, this fluctuation takes place explicitly for consciousness within itself, and is conscious of being the notion of reason, whereas the unhappy consciousness is only implicitly that notion. The absolute certainty of itself thus finds itself qua consciousness changed immediately into a sound that dies away, into an objectification of its being for self. But this created world is its speech, which likewise it has immediately heard, and only the echo of which returns to it. This return, therefore, does not mean that the self is in essence and actuality present in its speech. For essence is not for it and in itself, or merely implicit being, but its very self. Just as little has consciousness an outer existence, for the objective aspect does not get as far as being a negative of the actual self, in the same way that this self does not attain to an actual existence. It lacks the power to externalize itself, the power to make itself into a thing, and to endure mere being. It lives in dread of besmirching the splendor of its inner being by action and an existence, and in order to preserve the purity of its heart, it flees from contact with the actual world and persists in its self-willed impotence to renounce itself, which is reduced to the extreme of ultimate abstraction, and to give itself a substantial existence, or to transform its thought into being and put its trust in the absolute difference between thought and being. The hollow object which it has produced for itself now fills it, therefore, with a sense of emptiness. Its activity is a yearning which merely loses itself as consciousness becomes an object void of substance, and rising above this loss and falling back on itself finds itself only as a lost soul. In this transparent purity of its moments, an unhappy so-called beautiful soul, its light dies away within it, and it vanishes like a shapeless vapor that dissolves into thin air. Paragraph 658 is a long one, and there's a lot going on in there, including a reference back to previous sections of the Phenomenology. Hegel's also bringing up this figure, or gestalt, we could say, the shape of consciousness, that is called the beautiful soul, the schöne Seele. And this is quite important. He's giving us an analysis here of it, and it's not just a conceptual analysis, it's also one in terms of affectivity as well. And so this is one of the traps that morality can fall into. And, you know, this has drawn a lot of attention from commentators and interpreters, not least because Hegel actually gives you a nice phrase here, the beautiful soul, to hang things on, but because people see this happening in era after era after era. It's not something you could say peculiar to the dialectic as Hegel is laying it out. This is something that a lot of people who don't buy into Hegel's larger project have drawn out of it. And I think there's really something here worth identifying. But we also want to locate it within this process as it's going on within the phenomenology. We don't want it to become, ironically, just yet another abstraction, right? So let's take a look at what's actually going on here. So in the previous paragraph, we have this turning point where, because the acting subject is not actually acting, was withdrawing into themselves, into pure self-knowing and pure conscience and pure consciousness as self-consciousness, we see everything becomes abstractions, and it's really, sort of like sand falling through its hands, you could say. So he says, looking at this submergence of consciousness within itself. What is the submergence? Well, pure self-consciousness would involve a going under, a submergence, a sinking into on the part of consciousness of the world, of others, of things. and then we have pure self-consciousness, just sort of navel-gazing, you might almost say. So he says that looking at this emergence, we see that the unexplicated substance is, for consciousness, knowledge as, not as knowledge, but as its knowledge, as the knowledge that it has. And so he says, as consciousness, it's divided into this antithesis of itself and its object, which is, for it, essence. And so antithesis here is Gegensatz. We could just say opposition if you want to. It doesn't have to be necessarily antithesis. And the Gegensatz is important because it's between the thing itself, or rather not a thing, consciousness, and its Gegenstand, the thing that is over against it, right? So the Gegensatz is sort of putting something over there, and now there's me and my object. And so we have this itself and object, and both of these are within consciousness. He says, an object which is for its essence, it is just this object that is perfectly transparent. It's not like other objects where there's sort of resistance. An object which is its own self. And its consciousness is only this knowledge of itself. Okay, so it's not really an object standing over against me as a thing, or even as an other, right? Another self-consciousness. It's just me standing against myself. This is part of why he's going to bring up the unhappy consciousness a little bit later, when I think, looking at this, we could criticize Hegel and say, why are you bringing up the unhappy consciousness at this point? What's going on here is much more similar to what's happening in the reason section, or even maybe in the Stoicism and Skepticism part of self-consciousness, or, some other things, right? So we'll talk about that in a moment. Let's follow this out. The knowledge that it has, the Wissen, is really only of itself. So we're not getting out of this problem of abstractions that don't seem to really mean anything, although they sound awfully nice. And he goes on and he says, all life, all spiritual essentiality has withdrawn into the self and lost its difference from the I itself. Now, there's an achievement here, right? All life, all spiritual essentiality is no longer outside of me, it's in me. But does that do me any good? Well, let's go on and see. The moments of consciousness, he says, are these extreme abstractions, none of which endures, but each of which loses itself in the other and produces itself. So this is a fluctuating attitude, is how Miller is translated. A Wechsel, an interplay back and forth. It is a fluctuating attitude to itself of the unhappy consciousness. But here the fluctuation takes place explicitly for consciousness within itself. How is this different than the unhappy consciousness? Little reminder. The unhappy consciousness, which is a dialectic and a shape of consciousness coming after the self-consciousness origin, struggle to the death, master-slave dialectic, Stoicism, Skepticism, unhappy consciousness, long section, basically about humankind's religious attitudes, which consist in a projection of what is essential out there onto a divine other, something that's going to be eternal, something that's going to matter, and we then become the unessential worshipers or objects of salvation, petitioners, whatever it's going to be. There's lots of different particular content that can go into this, and he goes through that. You can go back to the unhappy consciousness section to check that out. So in that case, there's this projection outside of ourselves of something that isn't really outside of ourselves, but we forget that we're doing the projection. As a matter of fact, it becomes part of our society, part of our social dynamic, that we think that there is an absolute Lord or pantheon or whatever it's going to be, right? So in this case, we don't have that taking place because it's in us. We know we're not projecting something outside of ourselves. It's all getting projected inside. Now the question is there enough inside in there for all of this to be sustained? And the answer is no, there isn't. It requires, in a certain respect, so I'm going to say something that goes outside the text here, but kind of leads us to where we're going later on. if the problem of the unhappy consciousness is projecting on the part of an essential consciousness, its essentiality outside of itself onto some others, and also not being happy with other human others, except maybe intercessors, as that essential other, the problem here is, in some respects, the opposite. The others outside of ourselves are also essential. They are other self-consciousnesses. And we thought we could bring it all into ourselves and make ourselves the locus point for meaning. And this is part of what the Enlightenment itself is oriented towards. And, we can see this in more speculative frameworks. We can see this in very practical frameworks. That's the limit that's being reached here. So he goes on and he says that this consciousness is conscious of being the notion of reason, the Begriff der Vernunft, right? Whereas the unhappy consciousness is only implicitly that notion. And you remember the unhappy consciousness terminates and then leads into that entire reason section. So this is realizing what was going on in the reason section. Remember, too, where did reason end up? In practical reason, giving laws to itself, and then some problems on that respect that had to lead us then to spirit, to the community, right? So we've got all this stuff going on here, and then we've got this transformation moving to the notion of reason. Now he talks about a kind of talking or speech. He says, the absolute certainty of itself finds itself as consciousness changed immediately into a sound that dies away. A sound. Now, we're not yet at speech, but it's making some sort of sound. Into an objectification of its being for self. Now he talks about it as being speech. This created world, schaffene Welt, this world that we're creating through our knowing, through our potential agency, acting, is its speech, Rede, it's talking, it's discourse, which likewise it has immediately heard and only the echo of which returns to it. Now he goes on with this metaphor and he says this return does not mean the self is in essence an actuality present in its speech. Essence is not for it an in itself or merely implicit being, but its very self. Now, what's the problem here? I mean, this sounds pretty great, right? It's bringing in the dimension of language. Isn't that involvement with the other? Sure, we can go on further. He doesn't do that here, though. He says, just as little has consciousness an outer existence, the objective aspect does not get as far as being a negative of the actual self. In the same way, this self does not attain to an actual existence. The self at this point, with all of this, really interesting development, can't sustain itself. It's reliant on something else to sustain it, and it's not affecting the world which continues to exist outside of it, that it hasn't attained a relation to at this point. So he says it lacks the power to externalize itself. It lacks this power to make itself something other. A dynamic that we've seen in all the discussion about duty and action, right? It always involves an externalization, a subjecting of oneself and one's action and intentions and fulfillment of duty and plans and all that to a world which is to some degree outside of our control and which will reinterpret our action and which we are connected to and can't get away from. This self is trying to get away from that and thereby doesn't externalize itself. It lacks the power to make itself into a thing and to endure mere being. To endure mere being, what does that mean? That means being willing to have other people tell you what the meaning of your action is. Many people can't handle that. They need to tell everybody else what is really going on. But a mature relationship to reality is not just a mature relationship to external things. It's a mature relationship to others and being willing to handle them telling you, you're a jerk. Your motives are actually not as good as you make them out to be. And be able to endure that, right? So he goes on and he's got this wonderful phrase here. It lives in dread of besmirching the splendor of its inner being by action and existence. Now, dread, anxiety is another way of translating this. Angst. It lives in angst. The angst is of acting and thereby what? Besmirching. How does this besmirching take place? Could be that I've got all these great ideas of who I am in my head, and when I try to go to do them, it's just a mess. Like when I try to go to draw, right? I can picture things in my head. I remember as a kid, being on this used to be my family farm. It was bought by this lawyer who put a bunch of goats there, and I remember seeing a goat on a picnic table and like almost taking a photograph of that in my mind, thinking I'm going to draw that later on. And I had exactly what I wanted it to look like in my mind, and then I go to use my clumsy hands that are not very well trained, and it came out looking like crap, right? So maybe our actions are like that. The besmirching takes place that way. Or maybe we act, and then somebody else comes along and says, as we've seen in the previous dialectics, oh, your motives are not as pure, your intention is not what you claim it to be, you're just trying to make a buck, you're trying to, get followers, you're trying to be a big shot, you're trying to do this to show somebody else up. It's possible for it to be besmirched in many ways. And one way you can make sure that it's not besmirched, don't do anything. If you're afraid of your actions being not exactly what you want, not having the splendor, the Herrlichkeit, you being the master, right, of the inner being of what it is that you intend, not being the hero of your own story, well, then just don't do anything. Just, put it on Twitter or Instagram about, all the wonderful things that you're intending to do, all the causes you endorse, but don't actually do anything. So he goes on, what else? By action and an existence, right? By actually existing as opposed to mere being, it doesn't match up entirely. And that's the wage of existence. I mean, here Hegel actually sounds like a hardcore existentialist, doesn't he? So those who are like, the existentialists are totally against Hegel, this is a great point of intellectual history where you want to say, oh, well, maybe not so much, right? Maybe they actually drew upon some aspect of this. He goes on, and he says, in order to preserve the purity of its heart, it flees from contact with the actual world, persists in its self-willed impotence to renounce itself, which it reduced to the extreme of ultimate abstraction and to give itself a substantial existence, or to transform its thought into being and put its trust in the absolute difference between thought and being. It renounces that. It renounces, let's go back to this, transforming its thought into being and putting its trust in the absolute difference between thought and being. This is the core of what Hegel's philosophy is about. You don't have ideas unless you actually put those ideas into existence, into action, and then they never turn out to be exactly what you intended them to be. There's always a Gegensatz there, or perhaps even fuller types of antitheses. And that's the way it works. That's what you get. If you want to say, oh no, I want it to be better than that, you're engaging in a kind of idealism that is not Hegelian idealism. He is making fun of this idealism here. So he goes on and he says, now this is where it gets really interesting in my view. He talks about a hollow object, right? A hohle Gegenstand. That is this object. It's hollow. And the hollowness is that there's nothing to really stand against it. All you've got are abstractions, right? The hollow object, which it has produced for itself, now fills it with a sense, or more specifically, consciousness of emptiness, Leerheit, Bewusstsein, right? A sense of emptiness. And he says, it does engage in activity, the beautiful soul. Its activity is a yearning which merely loses itself as consciousness becomes an object devoid of substance. And rising above this loss, falling back on itself, finds itself, and now here Miller says, only as a lost soul. He doesn't actually say a lost soul. He says, finds itself only as lost, verloreness, right? So there's an interesting thing there. It's finding, it's losing, it's finding that it's lost, right? what is it finding? It's a beautiful soul, but the beauty exists only in being detached from any sort of activity. If it does engage in real activity, real tun in this case, then it's not merely yearning and this emptiness. It becomes something real, and then it's no longer as beautiful, because any beautiful action, any morally beautiful action, can always be looked at as not entirely what it is and is also ugly. So he goes on and he says, in the transparent purity of its moments, an unhappy so-called beautiful soul, right? Its light dies away within it, and it vanishes like a shapeless vapor that dissolves into thin air. There's nothing really here, and even the beauty of the beautiful soul can't remain beautiful. And it would have to be translated into something more substantive, something real.